Could or would a medieval knight have used a Japanese samurai sword? So this is an interesting academic question. Would a medieval knight, let's say for the purposes of this video, 14th or 15th century knight from the classic era of plate armour, have used a Japanese samurai sword of the same era? This question actually comes up with a reasonable amount of frequency, I'm sure, kind of spurred on by fantasy novels perhaps and gaming and stuff like this. And the fact is that we don't have very much evidence at all for Japanese weapons making their way to medieval Europe, or indeed medieval weapons until we get to the 16th century making their way to Japan, although they did make their way there in quite some large numbers at that point. But the point is that this question does come up quite a lot, and it is an academic point, an interesting one that's worth considering, and also one which is sort of an obvious question to ask because there are certain parallels between Japanese and European swords, say in the 15th century, and the ways that they were used, the martial culture that they were used in, the fact that knights and samurai have some comparisons in terms of where they sit in society and the fact that they wear armour, and the other weapons that they use as well. So I think it's an interesting point to consider, and I think there's also some overlooked points that get missed by a lot of people when they make this discussion. We're going to cover quite a lot of points in this video, including specialization, ethnic bias, material science, the way that the weapons are used, perhaps availability, trade networks, things like that. So we're going to cover quite a lot of aspects in trying to answer this point. But before I go on, I want to say a little word about our sponsors for this video, who are Raid Shadow Legends. Raid has got loads to keep you engaged and entertained, including loads of champions to pick from, badass bosses, and millions of players. I bet you didn't know they've got 100,000 members on Discord and 40,000 on Reddit. With constant updates and a massive community, there's tons to keep you engaged with the game. So it's super easy to get involved. It's free to download, free to play, and there's a huge community that you can get advice on how to play and how to learn. So some amazing stats for you. Raid Shadow Legends has over 25 million downloads and over 1 million players play it every day. Since it started, over 2 billion person versus person arena battles have been fought. Every week, nearly 1,000 videos are posted on YouTube talking about Raid Shadow Legends, looking at strategies and learning how to play, and all sorts of useful information. Here on YouTube you can find videos about Raid Shadow Legends and how to beat certain bosses, champion reviews, and just how to get started as well. On Reddit you can find discussions about which champions to use for certain tasks and missions, and how you can combine them into your team. What I personally really like about Raid Shadow Legends is the arena battles, person versus person battles. I like trying to work up the tiers and trying to advance my champions and make them more powerful. I also really enjoy playing the missions and trying to improve my times and beat my previous records, which also gains me XP and advances my champions and makes them more powerful, which I can then use in the arena battles. So what's new in Raid? Well, just last month they released their biggest ever update. The main event here is the Doom Tower. It's a giant tower with 120 floors, a bunch of secret challenge rooms, and 12 seriously badass bosses to take on. I've been waiting for this for a long time and I just can't wait to dive in. There's never been a better time to get started, and here's the best part. The Raid team is giving away a bunch of new free goodies, plus a super special champion to get everyone started in the tower, Bulwark. He's absolutely awesome in Clan Boss, and he's also going to be a huge help in the tower against those bosses. If you want to get a huge head start in Raid, all you have to do is hit the link in the description below, and if you're a new player you'll get your free Void Champion Bulwark, 50 gems, an XP booster, some energy refills, and even an ancient shard as soon as you get into the game. All these sweet rewards are going to be waiting for you just up here in the inbox. And remember, these rewards are only for new players and only for the next 30 days. You can find me in game under the name Captain Context, of course, and if you're quick enough you can join my clan. And it's as simple as that. Just go to the link in the description below. It's free to download, free to play, and I'll see you in game. So thanks for sticking with us. Now back to the main content of this video. So the simple fact is that obviously there's a lot of parallels between samurai and knights, and I think a lot of people perhaps in other videos and just generally in discussions on this topic have also kind of compared knights from one era and samurai from another era, and it has to be admitted that a lot of people's exposure to samurai history is actually from the 16th century onwards, and not so much earlier in the kind of period of European knights. And equally, a lot of people compare, when they talk about European knights, and this has happened in video games when they compare samurais and knights, is they take knights from earlier periods, so they take maybe, 11th, 12th century kind of Crusader knight type things, or perhaps even up to 13th century. But I think it's kind of more interesting for the purposes of this video to compare knights and samurai and their respective swords, in this case the Japanese sword, and I'll clarify that in a second as well, from the same period. So let's talk about 14th and 15th century. And the simple fact is that by the 14th and 15th century, the Japanese sword is already pretty much in its classic and widely recognized shape and form. Not so true if we go back to maybe to the 9th, 10th century, this kind of Viking era. The swords are different form in Japan then, by and large, although they're starting to take the form that we classically recognise as the Japanese sword. And of course we've got comparisons in terms of the fact that relatively heavy armour is being worn both in Japan and medieval Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries, and so some of the considerations of combat are similar, in other words trying to bypass or get through, overcome armoured opponents. But there's some other parallels as well. The fact is that in both eras, and now if I go for a European sword as a comparison, in both eras we've got swords which can be used in two hands or one. Now, admittedly, if we're talking about Europe, we've also, of course, got the one-handed arming sword, and if we're talking about Japan, we've also got the wakizashi, and then we've got forms of knife and dagger as well, but those are outside the scope of this video. But for the purposes of this video, we're going to focus on what I'd essentially call the hand and a half weapon of both areas, geographic regions. In other words, a weapon, whether it's the long sword or the Japanese sword, that is predominantly used in two hands, but can be used relatively comfortably in one hand as well. Now, before I go on, I want to clarify why I'm referring to the Japanese sword and not saying katana, as some of you may be expecting me to do. And the simple fact is that the internet knows what a katana is, but in actual fact, for the 14th and 15th century, whilst the katana came in during this period, particularly in the 15th century via the uchi katana, it kind of started out as the tachi, okay? And the simple fact is that the differences between tachi and katana are worthy of probably several videos of their own, so I'm not going to go into that for the purposes of this video, but they're fundamentally similar swords. So let's address the first question here. Could a European, let's not limit this to a knight per se, but let's say man-at-arms, could a European man-at-arms or knight acquire a Japanese sword? Was this even possible in the 14th or 15th century? Well, the answer is yes. The simple fact is there were numerous ways that a Japanese sword could make its way to medieval Europe. For example, in the 13th century, there were these rather famous marauders known as the Mongols, who famously were at war with Japan for a time, and of course invaded Europe and were at war with the Persians and various other people. So, and China, of course. So the fact is that purely through the Mongols, Japanese weapons could, in theory, have found their way to Europe. But there were numerous trade networks. So Chinese merchants certainly made their way to Europe. Lots of goods, lots of material goods found their way from China to Europe. Admittedly, Japan on the whole was much more isolated in terms of international trade in this period than somewhere like China or perhaps even Korea. But the fact is that Japanese goods did find their way out of Japan through numerous means, through war, through raiding, through piracy. So there are numerous ways that something could have got out of Japan, like a sword could have got out of Japan. So assuming that a katana or tachi, a Japanese sword, found its way into Europe, medieval Europe in the 14th or 15th century, would a medieval knight have thought about using it? So we've got to unpack that question into a few different things. First of all, before I say anything else, I want to say, obviously, a trained warrior, or just any person actually, can pick up and use a thing. Anybody can pick up a katana and swing it, okay? It doesn't require some magical, mystical knowledge to know how to hit someone with a metal bar. It is, at the end of the day, a sharpened metal bar, and it's not hugely dissimilar to types of messer and falchion and sabre and things like this that Europeans were exposed to. It would have looked definitely exotic to them, but they would have seen that it's a sword, and it's pretty obvious how you hold it and how you can cut with it and how you can thrust with it. So on the surface, of course, they could have used it, but would they have used it? So there are many things leading to would they have used it, and the first thing that I want to focus on is ethnic bias, shall we say, or cultural bias. Now, the simple fact is that there are certain points in history where where weapons from outside of, shall we say, Christendom were used within Christendom for various reasons. Reasons of status, reasons of just cool factor, probably, reasons of external influence. So an example, so we've looked at Mamluk swords quite a lot on this channel. So we know that Mamluk swords come in through a combination of influences, partly due to the Egyptian campaigns, partly due to Ottoman invasions in certain parts of southeastern Europe, and partly through trade and various other things. So we know that, for example, the classically shaped Mamluk style sabre or shabla or kilich was influenced by areas outside of Christendom. And there's lots and lots of other examples. I'm just focusing on weapons, of course, here. But the fact is that it is possible that for some reason someone might have in Europe decided to use a Japanese style sword, but it has to be noted that until the 16th century there wasn't really this cultural knowledge and acknowledgement or glamour associated with medieval Japanese or even Chinese goods. So it was really in the 16th and particularly 17th century when the interest in the Far East became a thing, and owning something like a Japanese sword or indeed a Chinese sword, or in some cases Indian or Sri Lankan, would have that kind of prestige. It wouldn't have that cultural reference point in the 14th or 15th century. So there wouldn't be a cultural kudos to owning this or using this in the 14th or 15th century. And indeed, sort of counterbalancing any pull towards kind of attraction from something foreign and exotic, there's the kind of conservativeness of using what's culturally normal or appropriate for your nation. And the fact is, we have to recognise that even in the 14th and 15th centuries there were regional and national styles of fashion, styles of hat, for example, all the way up to obviously armour and weapons. And the fact is that we know that in the 14th and 15th, particularly in the 15th century, there was an English style of armour, there was a Italian style of armour. So the fact is that there was a degree of kind of belonging to a given area, region, culture, whatever. And I think that exerted a pressure, a positive pressure, on people to use what was normal in their area or their nation or whoever they owed their kind of fealty to. And this changed through time as well. And for example, in the Elizabethan period, we see that fashion at the English court changes when Queen Elizabeth I comes to the throne. So monarchs can very much influence, and this happened in Japan as well, can very much influence the fashion, including the weapons that are used by the people under them. Okay, so the next couple of points I want to focus on are specialisation and how the weapons were used. And these are the topics that I think most people who've broached this topic, this subject, have kind of focused on. And I think that they've looked at the differences between a European longsword, you know, the mechanical and obvious visual differences, and a Japanese sword, and they have focused on those two things, particularly in reference to armour. Now, there's a few things to say about this. So, first of all, absolutely, the Japanese sword developed in its context, okay, the context of feudal Japan for the needs of Japan. And equally, the same is true of the European longsword. That is not to say that either is necessarily better than the other in one regard, because they're for different cultures. They were developed in different places for fighting different opponents. That being said, there are some parallels, and I think these get overlooked sometimes when people are talking about the differences. The fact is, as I've said, they are both hand and a half, one or two-handed swords of varying lengths that can be used to cut and thrust, and importantly, not only used on the battlefield in armour against armoured opponents, but they're also used against unarmoured or lightly armoured opponents, both of them. And they're both used in civilian life, both used in fencing schools, both used in duels, in unarmoured duels in the street, and both used for self-defence. So actually, I think these two swords, despite the fact they look very, very different, actually have a lot more in common than they do that's different. And in some ways, I think that's why people focus on the differences. because it's easier to point out the differences perhaps. But you can overstate that point, and I think the differences are perhaps not as important as the similarities are. So the fact is that in terms of how these two weapons are used, well, the first thing we have to say is that we only have limited knowledge of how the Japanese sword was used in the 14th and 15th century. Really, most of what we know about kenjutsu is from the 16th century onwards. Okay, but that being said, we can assume, much to a certain extent we can with European swordsmanship, where we do know quite a lot about how these were used in the 14th and 15th centuries, but we also know how they were used in the 16th century. Now, were they used in the same way? Yes and no. So we see there's a difference, there's a change. Obviously, there is a major difference between Europe and Japan, because in Japan they kept using a very similar design of sword. In Europe we went through, you know, sword and buckler, longsword, mesa, and right the way through to so-called side swords, rapiers, rapier and dagger, blah blah blah, all in the same period that the Japanese were using basically the same kind of sword. So we can expect that there was more change in European swordsmanship over the 2 or 3 centuries we're talking about here, rather than in Japan. That being said, there were changes in Japan, and certainly if we look from the 16th century to the 19th century, despite the fact that they were still using the same kind of sword, with the Kaiyo Guntai saber aside for a minute, there were changes, definitely, because there were changes in the context of swordsmanship. You know, firearms came in the 16th century and became more and more important in warfare. And, you know, the manufacture of swords, the importance of swords, the place they played in society, the rules about swords, how long they could be, who could carry them, all of this kind of stuff changed in Japan. So the context of swordsmanship did change in Japan. So what we see from 19th century Japanese swordsmanship is not the same as what we would expect to see from 16th century Japanese swordsmanship, because, you know, by the 19th century we've got the development of kendo with protective armor, with bamboo shinai. This is not something really that existed in the 16th century when they were training with steel swords and wooden bokken and going through kata, in more like kenjutsu basically. So the differences in swordsmanship are definitely there. And incidentally, kendo was predominantly, I think, known as gekken before it became kendo. But you know, there are differences, and the kendo, for example, itself has developed quite a lot since it has first been devised. The rules, what you're allowed to do in it, used to be able to do kicks and trips and stuff, which are not allowed anymore. So it changed quite a bit, but probably not on the whole as much as European swordsmanship. That being said, the original question is, can a European knight use a Japanese katana? And the answer has to be yes. As I've already stated, it is a cut and thrust hand and half sword. The simple fact is that if a European knight is used to using one of these, yes, he's used to having 2 edges, he's used to having a crossguard, he's used to having a pommel at the back, not that that makes very much difference, and he's used to having quite a relatively, for this period anyway, pointy blade. But if he had to use one of these, he absolutely could. I mean, yeah, he doesn't have 2 edges anymore, he doesn't have a crossguard, but the fact is he's still got a single edge, he's still got a point, and he can see that. And also he is familiar with other weapons of the day, which I'll talk about in a minute as well, things like the Langmesser. So it's not like this is going to be a totally alien object to him. He will recognise it's just a single-edged sword and use it as such. Now, in terms of the specialisation, yes, absolutely, the European sword and the Japanese sword have specialised designs for their areas and for the context of the armour and the clothing and everything else. But that being said, a European knight using one of these still has a point, still has an edge, still has a grip that obviously can be used. Yes, doesn't have a crossguard, not that important if you're fighting in armour, but probably pretty important, a pretty big change for anyone who's used to having a crossguard when you switch to unarmoured fighting, so in self-defence or in a duel situation. But the fact is that this is not a totally dissimilar weapon, and they'd still be able to use it for fighting in armour in half sword. Well, that's what the Japanese did, fighting in armour. The point certainly is not going to be as effective at penetrating mail, in my opinion. Obviously, there needs to be more testing on this, but it's quite easy to see that for this period, European longswords are very slender pointed, much like rondel daggers are, and seem to be quite specialised for getting into small gaps, either into mail and through gambeson underneath or arming doublet underneath, or getting between the gaps of plates as well, including into the visor slits and into between plates articulations and stuff like this, which admittedly the Japanese sword point is maybe not so well geared for doing. Now, as I mentioned, people always focus on the longsword or indeed the arming sword, but they forget sometimes, I think, that in medieval Europe, knights sometimes used falchions or langmessers or similar weapons, and as we get into the 15th century you start to see the introduction of what we'd now call sabres basically as well. So the fact is that they were actually familiar with blade types that are more similar to the Japanese sword than the archetypal longsword of the period is. So indeed we do see, we've got the langmesser behind me, we do see in period artwork, particularly of the 15th century, we do see that there is a growing fashion for the knightly classes to not only either have an arming sword or a longsword, but sometimes they start wearing the langmesser as well, and of course earlier on they'd worn falchions. So I really don't see it as a big problem in terms of the shape and overall design of the sword. But there is an elephant in the room with the Japanese sword, and that's where we get to the technology of its manufacture. So I'll just switch over longsword and Japanese sword here, so to larger variants. So there is an elephant in the room here in terms of how these two blades are made. And the simple fact is that traditionally made Japanese swords, as I'm sure pretty much all viewers of this channel will know, have a differentially hardened blade. That is, they are, hopefully as you can see on this example here, they have a hamon, which is the wavy line along the cutting edge, and that is much harder than the rest of the blade, because the rest of the blade is covered in a type of clay, essentially, or kind of mixture, different mixtures depending on which workshop's making the sword, and then it is quenched when it is at hardening heat. It is quenched, and therefore the cutting edge becomes much harder, but also much more brittle, and we'll talk about that in a second, than the rest of the blade. Now, many people talking about Japanese swords, and people who are, shall we say, Japanese swordophiles, if that's an expression, say a lot of words about how this is a marvel of engineering and how this shows how the Japanese sword is more technologically advanced than other swords. The simple newsflash here, folks, is that differential hardening is actually something found all over the world. We find it on medieval eating knives. We find it on certain European swords, actually, occasionally. But we find it particularly on things like Gurkha kukris, Nepalese kukris. We find it on some Indian swords, some tulwars, certain Persian and Arabic-speaking world Shamshir type swords. So the fact is, we find differential hardening actually all over the sword making world, not used universally and not used all the time like it was in Japan, but the fact is that we do find it elsewhere. It's not a purely Japanese thing. It's not the Japanese didn't invent it, the Chinese probably invented it incidentally, so we find it with Chinese swords as well. So it's not a uniquely Japanese thing. Now, it has advantages and disadvantages. The obvious advantage is you end up with a harder edge. A disadvantage is a harder edge pretty much equals a more brittle edge as well. Now, some people will go, no, that's wrong, and you're oversimplifying the science. Yes, I am, but this is a YouTube video, so I have to oversimplify it a little bit. The toughness of the cutting edge relies on a lot of things, but the general rule here is that Japanese sword edges compared to European medieval sword edges are pretty much always harder. Okay, so if we're talking about ballpark figures, we expect a Japanese sword blade edge to be around 60 Rockwell at the cutting edge. An original, not a modern replica, an original medieval European longsword blade at best historically is usually around 50 Rockwell at the edge. In fact, lots of examples that have been tested have been found to be less than that. Sometimes significantly less, actually, but on a well-made, good example, we expect a European longsword blade to be, let's say, 50 rock bile at the edge. So yes, absolutely, the Japanese sword's harder at the edge. But a disadvantage is that the rest of the blade of the Japanese sword is essentially quite soft, and it's not a spring to the degree that a European sword is. So if I were to literally, and I could do this with this sword, I'm not going to do it because I like this sword and I don't want to ruin it, but if I put my knee against this sword and bend as hard as possible, if it's a traditionally made Japanese sword, it will bend and stay bent. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because at least it's not broken. I can straighten it again. And I tell you, as someone here who's straightened a lot of swords in my life, that's actually a sword which is bent is far better than the sword which is broken. But that being said, a European medieval longsword will spring and spring back to straight. Now, so you've got a trade-off there. One sword is a spring but has a softer edge, doesn't keep such a sharp edge for so long. The other sword has got a much harder edge and will keep a razor sharp edge for a very long time. I hate that expression, razor sharp, but you get what I mean. But it will bend. But there's a more important and sometimes overlooked aspect of this, and it is specifically referred to in a lot of Japanese sword books, actually, when talking about the Mongol invasions. So when the Japanese were using their tachi to fight Mongols in the 13th century, they were finding that some of their tips were breaking off on Mongol armour. Now, Mongol armour was, compared to Japanese armour of the time, pretty damn advanced and very all-encompassing, really. The fact is that Japanese swords were not, whilst they had evolved to face against Japanese armour of the time, they hadn't really been tested much against Mongol armour or other people's armour. So the fact is that they were hard, but they were brittle. And this is one of the big disadvantages of the Japanese sword edge. And the fact is, if you look at, for example, surviving beautiful quality and condition and restored, it has to be said, blades in the British Museum, there are around, certainly for an exhibition I went to in 2005, they had 89 old Japanese sword blades there, and a significant number of them had edge damage from use, and to some extent sometimes this was sharpened out. If it was near the tip, sometimes the tip was reprofiled, which sometimes means you're losing the hamon at the end of the tip, although that also sometimes happens from shortening. Although they were usually shortened at the tang end, they were sometimes shortened at the kasaki, at the point end. But the fact is that some Japanese sword blades have chips out of them and have notches out of them, and this happens. This happens when they hit other hard things. It happens when they hit other blades, happens even when they hit other, things like pole arms. But equally, if they hit armour, if they hit a kabuto, if they hit a piece of someone else's armour, there is a large likelihood they are going to chip. Now, in a European knight's context, is this a problem? Well, it kind of is, actually, yes, but particularly in the case of the point. And so one of the virtues of the European longsword point, or any European sword point, is that whilst it's not as hard as the Japanese sword point, it's more likely to not snap. Okay, so ironically, the way that these two swords are heat treated means that whilst the katana blade as a whole is more likely to bend than snap, the tip is more likely to snap than bend. So there we go. Pluses and minuses. You never just gain, whatever you gain, you usually lose somewhere else. And that's the case here. So I do think that this would be a tactical issue for a European knight to be aware of with his Japanese sword that he's decided to use, or maybe been forced to use because it was the only thing lying around. That tip, the problem is if that tip snaps off and you end up with a blunt tip, particularly if you're fighting armoured opponents, you're now faced half-swording people with something that not only didn't have a very pointy blade in the first place, but now doesn't have any point at all, and you stand no chance of going through mail, no chance of going even through an arming doublet. So what are you going to do? Well, you're going to just have to resort to using it as a cleaving weapon, using it like a cut-only falchion, basically. And yeah, you can do that, and that might be fine against normal soldiers not wearing so much armour. You can aim at the face and the leg and the places that they don't have armour covering. But if you're fighting against an armoured opponent, another knight, you've got a big problem now because you don't have any tip. So you probably have to resort to wrestling. but that's another good parallel between Europe, medieval Europe, and Japan. Obviously in Japan they've got the forerunners to jiu-jitsu, and in Europe we've got what the Germans would call ringen, but wrestling basically. In both places you've got wrestling in armour and out of armour, very, very important to any type of knightly or samurai fighting. So to conclude, would the medieval knight use a Japanese sword, or could they, or would they? Well, I think we've probably fairly completely answered the question that of course they could. It might not be optimal for them, but basically it wouldn't be hugely different to some of the weapons that they would have been familiar with anyway. So absolutely they could use it. Would they use it? Almost certainly not, because there wasn't any cultural reference point, there wasn't any real knowledge or prestige or kudos attached to using something from Japan in 14th or 15th century Europe at that time. They might think, wow, that looks pretty. But I'll use the longsword, I think. But they might think it looks a well-made object. They might realise, wow, this is really good for cutting things. But within the context of the armoured, certainly the armoured knight of the 14th and 15th century, they'd probably think, nah, the longsword's probably a better tool for the job. And it is, frankly. It's better at impacts with other metallic objects, particularly armour. It's got a better design point for penetrating through the gaps in armour and the things that might be underneath the armour. It's got a crossguard, which is, I think, evidence suggests that in Europe was seen as an advantageous thing, because crossguards got long and stayed long and then developed into complex guards. So they obviously liked handguards for use in unarmoured and dueling situations, self-defense situations. I think overall they would find, yeah, this is awesome. If you're fighting lightly armoured people, they'd probably think this was very much comparable to a two-handed version of something like an Ottoman kilich, or a shamshir, Persian shamshir, or something like that, or indeed a falchion or European sabre of the hanger of the day. So absolutely, I think in maybe a civilian situation they might think this is an awesome sword, but I'm not going to wear that, I'm not going to take that to war with me. But I might be wrong, because as I say, we do have artistic evidence of the time of fully armoured knights, probably men-at-arms in reality, wearing swords that we normally think of as unarmoured swords, that being things like the Langmesser. So there we go, folks. I hope that's conclusively answered. Would and could a medieval European knight of the 14th or 15th century use a Japanese sword, a tachi or a early katana? I think probably no. But it's an interesting, very interesting topic to contemplate. As always, I am fascinated to read your views on this. If you disagree with me, that's absolutely fine. And, post below, give me your thoughts. If you can think of things I haven't mentioned as well, or indeed, I mean, I don't think there's any evidence of Japanese swords being in medieval Europe in the 14th or 15th century. If there is evidence out there of that, I would absolutely love to know it, but I suspect that there's no evidence at all, and I've certainly never seen any, and I've been researching this stuff for a long time. But yeah, anything about your views, opinions, thoughts, or indeed other similar videos you want me, or topics you want me to cover in the future, feel free to post below. Please check that you're subscribed and click that notification bell, and I'll see you really soon again on the channel for another video. Cheers, folks.